We start at the pre-dawn of a revolution, the Soviet Revolution, a revolution dedicated to throwing off the shackles of preordained social order, a revolution against legacy, a revolution for the right to self-organize and self-determine as men as well as women, a revolution in systems theory as much as it was one in social and political theory. As the red embers of the revolution were cooling down, society came fumbling into the early dawning streets of the 20th century, like going out for coffee after a rager. It was a time to define a new person, a time to create aspirational movements and art forms and definitions of ourselves. Artist and philosopher Solomon Nikritin proposed the term projectionism for the brand of utopian art created in the 1910s and 1920s Russia. Named so for the rush ahead, the looking into the future it engenders. And what a beautiful term it is, encapsulating our hopes for the future as the technologically interconnected beings we were soon to become, describing our passion for looking out and looking forward, and also our tendency to project our biases, desires, fears, and the minutiae of our internal landscapes, complete with the less than aspirational aspects of them onto the mass amounts of data that we would soon find ourselves dealing with as humans, whether Soviet or not. By 1922, Solomon Nikritin and Sergei Luchishkin, and for poetics, I have to point out here that the lute re is Luch, which is the base of Sergei Luchishkin's last name. So he is like Sergei of the light or something, Sergei making the light. Solomon Nikritin and Sergei Luchishkin established the studio of the Projection Theater, where the theater's orchestral pit was filled with a noise orchestra. The noise orchestra can be understood today as a Foley orchestra, combined with a fantastical electronic light and sound orchestra, making everyday sounds, and sounds not replicable by the artists on stage for their theatrical productions. Today's sound designers in theater achieve and deploy these effects electronically with cues containing samples triggered from memory in a computer. This is from information from Sounds in Z, by the way. At the time, however, the idea that diegetic and fantastical sounds be composed and then performed by an orchestra, that they could perform noises rather than music, was truly aspirational. Which brings us to that age-old question: what is music and what is noise? Arseny Avramov was the polymath who tried to answer this question next. Avramov proposed unseating the 12-tone system from its porch of priority and integrating it with his so-called natural scale that was based on a series of microtones. Andrei Smirnov writes in Sounds in Z, now I'm reading from the book, shortly after the October Revolution, he proposed to the Commissar of Public Enlightenment, and how wonderful it is that there was a Commissar of Public Enlightenment at the time, Anatoly Lunacharsky, a project to burn all the pianos, symbols of the despised 12-tone octave-based well-tempered scale, which he believed had adversely affected human hearing for several hundred years. And frankly, I'm inclined to agree with him. During the 1920s, Avramov experimented with prepared piano, harmoniums, and various noise sources, as well as a symphony orchestra to develop new approaches to organizing sound that are very similar to recent techniques in electroacoustic and spectral music. He explored new genres of music devised for urban contexts and presented his acclaimed Symphony of Sirens performed in Baku, Uzbekistan, in 1922. The Symphony of Sirens can be described as a spectacle of social engineering. But unlike its predecessor, the Potemkin villages, it was not created to be observed by a single monarch at the head of the social body. But the entire social body here was playing for itself. There was no audience for the Symphony of Sirens. Everyone was a participant. The Potemkin villages were a composition meant to show only that which was desired by a single soul. And it's worth noting here that though they were created for Catherine the Great, ostensibly she didn't know they were a performance. They were commissioned by Grigory Potemkin, the sole audience of this entire enterprise. The Potemkin villages establish a fluidity of category in the Russian psyche between settlement and theater. Symphony of Sirens creates this relationship between music and industry. Finally, Avramov argued for the importance of investing in so-called radio musical instruments. And this is a quote from, again, Sounds in Z by Andrei Smirnov. Although it is not absolute novelty, Theremin already showed his musical machine in Moscow several years ago in its first embryonic edition. It is also the truth that since then a lot of scientists and technicians in Moscow and Leningrad have been working on similar technical projects, but only by Theremin. And only in the last years has it been possible to develop his invention on that level of artistic musical importance, which allows us to qualify his lecture concerts as the biggest musical events of our days. Theremin describes his Therevox as pulling sounds out of the ether. The ether, surely a noisy place, variously described as being above the clouds, the heavens, the universe itself, was recently mentioned in Wired magazine in an article titled, "While your phone's encryption protects the files on the device, plenty of data finds its way out into the ether." What indeed happens to the information floating around in the ether? And how can we make it make sense to us? Theremin would perhaps say, you must fashion a beacon of the correct shape to attract the kind of information you desire. And here again is a quote from Smirnov. Leon Theremin, who used to stand in front of an electronic contraption and conjure otherworldly sounds from the ether, was reported by his contemporaries to have filled the room with sound, and that it was positively spooky. One visitor reported, no wires, no gadgets, nothing visible, merely electromagnetic sorcery. As a physicist, musician, and engineer, Theremin worked at the crossroads of creative technology and espionage, developing innumerable projects, often trying to combine music with color, gesture, scent, and touch. It is hardly possible today to imagine synthesizers, security systems, or automatic doors without his groundbreaking research. But in fact, Theremin's interests were much wider, including experiments into increasing human sensitivity thresholds by means of hypnosis and beyond, a topic familiar to goers to hacker conferences such as Hope Today, where classes on social manipulation, engineering, and hypnosis are held. Like an alchemist in search of the philosopher's stone, since the 1920s, Theremin has been trying to solve the problem of immortality. So this is Smirnov quoting Theremin now. I was fascinated with the idea of the struggle against death. I studied the life of biological cells of animals buried in permafrost. I was interested in what would happen to people if their bodies were frozen and defrosted again. Lenin died in 1924. As soon as I found out about it, I made a decision. Lenin should be buried in frozen ground, and in a while I shall restore him. I had a reliable assistant who I sent to Lenin's residence in Gorky to find out how to manage this. He came back very soon. It was too late to do anything. Lenin's brain and heart had already been removed and placed into a vessel with alcohol, and thus all cells were already dead. I was strongly affected. It seemed to be that having obtained Lenin's body, we could understand any defects on a scientific level and restore it. I was ready to do this. Today, the mummified body of Lenin lies in a mausoleum on the Red Square, above another immortalized mummy not 100 meters away and not 2 or 3 meters below lies a woolly mammoth named Yuka in the City Museum of Moscow. Yuka was preserved naturally by the permafrosts of Yakutsk and discovered in 2014, approximately 2 decades after Thurman's death. In March of 2019, researchers from Japan attempted to stimulate cells from Yuka's tissue, and did achieve some biological processes indeed, but they did not attain their goal of activating cell division. The master of transmission arts managed to create the right circumstances to pluck angelic sounds out of the ether. Francis Dyson writes in The Tone of Our Times, "Dissonance, or noise in music, was a necessary, although not always welcome component of the celestial harmony that liturgy enacted. However, there is another sense in which noise, dissonance, and discord contribute to the liturgical function in recent history. Although liturgy seems to have become less popular in worship, Kantorovich, another great researcher with a perfectly perfect name, points to an unexpected rise in the 1920s, revived by theologians and musicologists at precisely the moment in which the European political scene was dominated by the emergence of Pythagorean cosmology in theosophy and its uptake in experimental music and the music of the avant-garde. According to Douglas Kahn, followers of the occult in the latter half of the 19th century took Pythagorean and Platonic thought to heart, as such followers do to this day. Whatever the reason they might have felt out of place, they continued to seek assistance from music to place them in the cosmos and social order. Like earlier Pythagoreans, they were required to respond to criticism. Developments in mathematics and measurement made it obvious that Pythagorean notions were no more than hopeful arithmetic and geometry. Concerns in Western art music challenged harmonic traditions with increasing dissonance, and audiophonic technologies, telegraphy, telephony, phonography, and radiophony, helped transform the nature of auditory culture itself, raised expectations that phenomena should be audible, increased the sphere of what had yet to be heard, and based all sound, music included, more firmly in the materialist rhetoric of acoustical vibration. So here is Francis Dyson again. Despite its ubiquity, noise is one of the most difficult sonic categories in sound studies. Difficult because its negativity hides an existential necessity, in a cosmic sense, that is. When we are speaking about the infinite, noise is the background chaos or flux from which all being originates. For such a degraded sound, the eschatological range of noise is extraordinary, participating in origins and endings across millennia, like the infinite, like the concept of existence itself, it is impossible to imagine the absence of noise. As a pair, however, noise and the infinite are impacted. From philosophy to aesthetics to cultural commentary, we find the sonic or static-filled immateriality of noise fusing with the metaphysical, cosmological, and eschatological abstraction of the infinite to form an intensely productive but also highly unstable entity. Think, for instance, of the Big Bang, an origin myth that encapsulates some of the current dimensions of noise. According to some, the term Big Bang was coined by Fred Hoyle satirically as a way of emphasizing the theory itself. Our description of the universe, of our own all everything that there is a pun. While Hoyle has denied it, the anecdote itself demonstrates the confused beginnings of the sound, which is at once an echo of the bang and the bang itself. It was noise, as static and interference, that first prompted astronomers to theorize a beginning to the universe, in the form of a massive explosive event, evidenced by traces of a noise that is simultaneously momentous and banal. This cosmic noise was first seen as an interruption, something that stood between the signal and the information that it held. In fact, researchers were looking for ways to eliminate it. This is not surprising, since the elimination of noise is integral to the concept of noise itself, noise being that which we don't want to hear. Randomness is an exciting and essential topic in the history of computer science. Various kinds of randomness have been used to generate noise and signal to different effect, always revealing an underlying truth about the universe in the process. In signal processing, white noise is a random signal having equal intensity at different frequencies, giving it a constant power spectral density. The term is used with this or similar meanings in many scientific and technical disciplines, including physics, acoustical engineering, telecommunications, and interestingly, statistical forecasting. White noise refers to a statistical model for signals and signal sources rather than to any specific signal. White noise draws its name from white light, right there. Although white light does not have a flat power spectral density over the visible band. White light is merely the total saturation of our human receptors. The human visual system does not even see an octave's worth of light waves. Sadly, there are no harmonic resonances to be perceived in color as there are in sound. Full saturation of the spectrum is a function of the measuring stick, in this case, our eyes. White noise refers to a sequence of samples that have been serially correlated or have an identical probability distribution, whether in a one-dimensional sound or a two-dimensional plane image. If each sample has a normal distribution with zero mean, this is from Wikipedia, the signal is said to be additive white Gaussian noise. Additive and Gaussian are both words we recognize from signal processing. These are words that conjure a certain audiovisual quality or effect to the mind's eye, algorithms that have imprinted themselves in our memory. In radio reception, radio noise is unwanted, random electrical signals, fluctuating voltages always present in the radio receiver in addition to the desired radio signal. These fluctuations are present in any recording apparatus, which is essentially a radio receiver, or space, in any space. We may call them room tone, interference, the noise floor, film grain, image noise, shot noise, etc., etc. Radio noise is a combination of natural atmospheric noise created by the electrical atmosphere like lightning, human-made radio frequency interference from other electrical devices picked up by the receiver's antenna, and thermal noise present in the receiver input circuits, caused by the so-called random thermal motion of molecules. Radio receivers receive quite a bit of information about the natural world. However, said information may not be desired by the operators and is therefore noise. The level of noise determines the maximum sensitivity and reception range of a radio receiver. If no noise were picked up, even weak transmissions could be received at virtually any distance to those signals. With no noise present, if a radio source is so weak and far away that the radio signal in the receiver has a lower amplitude than the average noise, the noise will drown out the signal. The level of noise in a communication circuit is measured by the signal-to-noise ratio. In computing, a hardware random number generator, or a true random number generator, is a device that generates random numbers from a physical process, rather than from an algorithm. Such devices are often based on microscopic phenomena that generate low-level, statistically random noise signals, such as the thermal noise mentioned above, shot noise, and other quantum phenomena. These stochastic phenomena are in theory completely unpredictable, and the theory's assertions of unpredictability are subject to experimental testing on an ongoing basis. This is in contrast to pseudo-number random generators that are commonly used in computer programming, which you may be familiar with. Even such systems, however, require the use of algorithms to help cope with the bias inherent in the random numbers that they produce. So even random number stream produced from measuring the vibrations of molecules, thermal molecules on a circuit or whatever, it has a bias and is not random. And so we must adjust with an algorithm, a human-made algorithm, to make it more random. There are currently two such systems in use. One is called software whitenings, based on algorithms invented by Jan von Neumann, and the other solution is implemented in hardware. It creates a feedback loop by sending a filtered version of the stream back into the stream generator. So our random number generator is conscious, the topic of my next talk. And now I'll finish off this talk with another reading from Tone of Our Times. I think Francis Dyson perfectly closes out this story with noise, capitalized, as the ultimate guarantor. It is possible to avoid the thought of finitude or the concept of a limit, while at the same time drawing boundaries around the self that are strong enough to make individual rights plausible. Indeed, it was only on the basis of establishing a continuous hierarchy of intelligences, angels, demons, and souls, that communicated in a great chain, which begins and ends with the One, that it was possible to construct either the unified subject of modern science or civil administration and government. So I'm guessing this is European pre-Enlightenment philosophy. Yeah. In this context, noise follows the long list of sonorous phenomena setting the individual within a structure of governance that entails an ordering so complex that it is virtually unquestionable. Through noise, the individual or group demarcates a space for itself as an identity, having a unique voice that can and must be heard through the din of Doha. So, identity, interest groups and politics, guilds, etc., etc. The inherent challenge of noise has been drafted during periods of both musical and social experimentation, fueling debate between traditional musicologists and those with a more experimental bent, between a culture of symphonies and a subculture of local live music. Punk rock, well, unless you're a symphony orchestra of noise. Punk rock, for instance, barged its way through the polite discourse of musicology, tying noise to anarchism and its revolt to no future. No future, in quotes. The appropriation of the more radical and political aspects of punk rock has been well documented. But what was interesting in the initial phase was that the way noise was so closely tied to the perception of decline. Noise was in fact the expression of youth anger at the obvious end of growth. Only later did noise then, as an initial reaction, a shouted response, a loud protest, find its way into popular culture and the art gallery as an aesthetic form and material in itself. Noise, with a lowercase n, becoming noise with a capital N. Culturally, this paradox, like its theistic and philosophical predecessors, enables other paradoxes to sit comfortably within the modern imaginary, and, until the last few decades at least, be expressed in the assumption of eternal growth. The short-term short-sightedness of this assumption, so eternal growth is something that economists in the US believe. They believe that companies must grow every quarter, that dividends and revenues must grow every quarter, and that success, economic success, is measured in growth. But what happens when something is stable? This is not rewarded. Only growth is rewarded. However, in a context, a finite context, whether it's the pool of available resources, the city, or the planet itself, ultimately our context is indeed finite, and eternal growth is, of course, a horrible, horrible delusion. The short-term short-sightedness of this assumption appears, ironically, in the word itself. Perhaps Hoyle should have taken a lesson from the angelic choir, given that the onomatopoeic expressivity of bang rapidly diminishes after its initial vocalization. Or perhaps he was cognizant of the irony and contradiction that noise contains, for how can we talk about it without sounding like idiots? Who would in all earnestness argue that infinity itself could arise from such ambiguity, such insufficiency, such a ludicrous and demeaning concept? As if the human intellect could discover the origins of the universe, but was incapable of articulating it without lapsing into infantile and incoherent speech. How could anyone have not understood the term as a joke? But misunderstand it they did, and as a result, the modern understanding of the origins of the universe echo, however faintly, with satire. One could almost say that satire reverberates through noise once it is taken seriously, once it is capitalized, once a Big Bang with lowercase b's becomes the Big Bang with capital letters throughout. By using signal noise, amplifying background noise, attenuating the sound of the recording apparatus or the playback system, deliberately using the rejects of a work, glitch aestheticizes the sound of the technology playing the sound of the technology. That is, the technology sounding itself. According to Stern, the aestheticization of noise runs parallel to the industrial use of noise to mask or even perceptually eliminate the noise of transmission in telephonic transmission. In the 1960s and 70s, while thinkers on a wide range of fields have defined noise as something to be eliminated, dentists, architectural acousticians, artists, and musicians began to explore ways of rendering noise useful. Similarly, where computers had been used to model perception and as musical instruments during the 1970s, they were increasingly reconceived as sound media in their own right. This connection between industrial imperatives and artistic practices is most evident in the corporate sponsorship of art projects that would integrate experimental music and sound. Noise as a sonic component, the engineer as artist, and IT research within the architecture of developing consumerism, be it gallery, exhibition event, or festival, such as the infamous 9 Evenings, theater and engineering held in New York in 1966 and sponsored by Bell Labs. Or perhaps the most potent example, the Pepsi Pavilion at the Osaka World Fair. Ikeda's visual patterns move from signal to noise, literally and metaphorically moving in and out of visual and oral perceptibility, and especially in event space, the rapidity of visual pattern and the high pitch of the tones produce a dizzying sensation. Noise, both visual and sonic, engulfed by, perhaps returning to, its roots in nausea. If this noise is evidence of the limit of human perception, so too is its corollary in ecologic evinces the limits of comprehension. While it is commonly accepted that measuring both the market and the climate is a necessarily reductive enterprise, otherwise economists and climate scientists would be overwhelmed with data, the setting for this reduction is, like the gallery, also a setup, enabling the simulation of experience or understanding only because the walls that the gallery or Wall Street provide. And this piece is called Datamatics. I'm reading a review by user SMCM, and it says, "We were shot out into a three-dimensional space, rotating amongst the galaxies, while individual stars amongst the seemingly random patterns were picked out with monotonous regularity. Wolf 359, Alpha Centauri, Bernard Star, Ross 154, Tau Ceti. New details began to appear on screen, such as each star's magnitude, distance from the Earth, and spectral classification. All of this data feeding into an increasingly red-shifted sound mix, the collection of tiny sounds building to a rocket engine roar." Tyson says, "The visualization, sonification, and quantification of massive amounts of data representing unimaginable complexity, for instance, a genetic sequence and the infinite vastness of the universe. Each piece begins fairly innocently. This screen is black with small white dots resembling the stars on a clear night. The entire panorama rotating slowly to the soft, harmonically complex noise. This time, the beep has a clear visual analog, a red crosshair that captures each dot." And I'll stop reading here. The crosshair captures each star representing limitless potential in the beyond of the infinite universe, the unknown, the true unknown to humans today. The crosshair captures it like a scanner in an Amazon warehouse. Determined by an algorithm, all the objects in the warehouse are known, perhaps to the algorithm designer, or perhaps only to the algorithm itself. But the human operator organizes and moves these items, gets all of their information from a scanner, and is but a part of moving these objects around in the capitalist machine. Ikeda is performing 21st century projectionism, the kind that perhaps Nikritin would have been in awe to perceive. Here we are, no longer needing to build Potemkin villages to convince ourselves. We can project our ideas, biases, fears, and hopes of the organization of space, time, the universe itself, so strongly onto the outside and unknown world before us, that it will affect the fabric and makeup of the universe, enough that we believe that structure to be true. So, here we end our talk. Thank you so much for listening. talk/reading. And now I will open the floor for questions.